Imagine forcing a segment of the population to register with the government solely based on who they are or their personal beliefs. I want to tell you about the secret history of Marvel's Civil War. We're going to talk about the seeds that were sown over 25 years before the 2006 miniseries that changed the face of the Marvel Universe, how the Civil War actually started, how Tony Stark was the actual villain of the Civil War, and how Tony Stark might have been right. The first hints of the Registration Act began in 1980 when the X-Men learned of their days of future past. In the far future year of 1984, a bigoted president passed the Mutant Control Act, which forced anyone with an X gene to register with the government. This led to a dystopian world overrun by mutant hunting sentinels. Now, fortunately, thanks to time travel, the X-Men were able to avoid this future, shunting it off to Earth 811. Meanwhile, in Britain, on Earth 238, Mad Jim Jaspers passed an anti-superhero law. This led to the creation of the nigh-adaptable Fury, who wiped out all superheroes on that Earth. Jim Jaspers of Earth 616 tried the same thing on the main Marvel Earth, but he was stopped by, well, not really Captain Britain, but by the Fury itself. Honestly, that's a story for another day. Meanwhile, in the U.S., Senator Robert Kelly tried to pass Senate Bill 1, the Mutant Affairs Control Act. Although it didn't pass, it did lead to mutant registration eventually. This led to a public awareness campaign encouraging people to find out if members of their own family might be mutants. And if this phrase sounds familiar, there was actually a public awareness campaign in the real-world 1980s that was feeding into the paranoia of a lot of parents by saying, "It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are?" This led to the creation of the Commission on Superhuman Activities, where they recruited the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants to become Freedom Force and fight for the government to attack those nasty X-Men. This finally came to a head with the original Fall of the Mutants storyline. After the X-Men faked their own deaths, the Mutant Registration Act remained in effect, although it did end up losing some of its teeth. Then, during Loki's Acts of Vengeance, the House tried to pass HS 39110, which would have effectively registered all superhumans. This was discussed in the 1989 Marvel Year in Review. In this magazine, published as an in-universe document, we see the first time in which Captain America and Iron Man are on opposite sides of registration. Captain America says that individual freedoms are far more important than the congressman's fears. Meanwhile, Iron Man, speaking as Tony Stark, says that he feels that superhuman registration might be important and something that the government should consider. While that never got through Congress, it's interesting that even back then, Cap was anti-registration and Iron Man was pro-registration. Now, that being said, a similar law did pass in Canada. The Paranormal Registration Act enabled Canadian authorities to hunt down unregistered paranormals. Although this was later found out to be a plot by the Master of the World, the law stayed in effect, even if it was enforced less and less often. Getting closer to the actual Civil War, we need to talk about the Illuminati. Unbeknownst to Captain America and 99% of the world's superhuman population, Iron Man and several of the most influential superheroes were secretly meeting to basically plan out future events. Black Panther was invited to join, but he declined, saying that this would only lead to infighting. After sending the Hulk into space, Iron Man told the Illuminati that Congress was planning to pass Superhero Registration Act 6 USC Section 558. As a futurist, Tony said that he could predict future events, and he knew that it was only a matter of time before specifically a young superhero team would get together and do something very public, very bad, and that this would lead to a backlash by the public and a forcing of this Registration Act. So he suggested that the Illuminati get together publicly and support this act. The other members of the Illuminati were disgusted and said no. And hey, would you look at that? There's a team of young heroes who recently starred a reality show in which they hunt down hidden criminals. Nothing could go wrong there, right? Something went wrong there. Something very wrong. This is getting too long. I mean, I could turn this into a whole Ken Burns style thing. But next time, part 2, we look at how Tony Stark is the villain of Civil War. And if you'd like to know more about my thoughts on Civil War, especially a issue-by-issue breakdown, we covered it in the latest edition of My Primos podcast, available on podcast streamers everywhere.
John Fernandez was one of us, a newsman. The last time I saw Johnny was 8 days ago. He told me he'd just gotten full-time work with the New Warriors reality show. I wished him luck, told him to be careful. He used to say all the times he'd been bombed or shot at were just practice runs for the real thing. But he always was careful, and he always figured he'd see it coming.
Robbie Robertson, Civil War, Day 1. We're doing a retrospective on Marvel's Civil War. My name's Garcia, and I worked for the official handbooks of the Marvel Universe for about 10 years. And last time I talked to you about how the superhero registration has its roots going back to comic books all the way back in 1980 with the Mutant Registration Act. But I also mentioned how Tony Stark predicted that a young superhero team would cause a very public incident that would force the government to institute superhero registration. And would you look at that? It happened. But there's a hitch. Just a few weeks earlier, Tony was speaking before the Senate Metahumans Investigations Committee. He was there with his then employee Peter Parker talking about why maybe the government shouldn't institute registration. But then they were attacked. Iron Man's old enemy Titanium Man interrupted the proceedings. He was stopped by Spider-Man, who was of course on hand, but this only encouraged the senators that they needed to really consider superhuman registration. Now, afterwards, Peter asked Tony, "Man, that was a weird coincidence that just as you were talking about the dangers of superhuman abilities, a superhuman showed up." And Tony said, "Yeah, weird coincidence, huh?" Afterwards, Iron Man paid off Titanium Man. I know what you're thinking. This is super suspicious, right? But I'm sure there's nothing really wrong here. I mean, nobody actually got hurt, and all it did was prove Iron Man's point that he had made previously to the Illuminati that this is something the government was going to take seriously. And then there's what happened to Nitro, the villain who actually blew up that community in Stamford, Connecticut while fighting the New Warriors. As a human bomb, he actually takes credit for killing Captain Marvel, the guy that inspired Carol Danvers to be Captain Marvel. Of course, he did it by causing him to get cancer. It's a whole thing. Anyway, the point is, after he blew up that town, he reassembled himself and just disappeared. Wolverine said, "I'm going to personally track him down." Iron Man said, "Don't. Let the authorities handle it. Stay out of the way." Wolverine, of course, ignored this and eventually found Nitro. It turns out Nitro had been hiding in a safe house provided to him by somebody with a lot of money. It also turns out that he had some mutant growth hormone that he'd been using to augment his powers to have even larger explosions. And he was also calling somebody for assistance when Wolverine tracked him down. Now, all of these things were tracked to people who technically worked with Stark's company, but it was never directly tied to Tony Stark. As the government's discussion of registration continued, Captain America went underground, fighting criminals without seeking any kind of fame. Tony's allies, on the other hand, sought as many public battles as they could, even high-fiving in front of the cameras. After the Registration Act passed, specialized SHIELD agents, nicknamed Cape Killers, hunted down anyone who wore a costume or had powers, even firing potentially lethal rounds at teenagers. To help calm matters, Tony convinced his protege, Peter Parker, to unmask publicly, assuring him that he'd be safe because that's what the SHRA was for. It's interesting that when Peter did this, he didn't wear his costume at that time, the Iron Spider outfit that Tony gave him, but his original costume. This classic look and Peter's earnestness helped Tony's side gain a lot of public sympathy. But there was ominous thunder on the horizon. Tony, Reed Richards, and Hank Pym, secretly a Skrull, though we didn't know that at the time, cloned Thor, who was dead for a bit, and turned this cyborg clone of Thor against Cap's forces, killing Bill Foster, Goliath. This is tragic for many reasons, but from a storytelling point of view, it's troubling that the first and really only hero to die in the main book after the initial incident was a black hero who had not been seen in many years. Tony excused Clone Thor's behavior by saying he acted as any cop would have. Oof. And then there's Prison 42. This was a secret facility built in the middle of enemy territory in the negative zone, which would house political prisoners of the United States. Guantanamo. And last time I said that Tony had planned a lot of this with the Illuminati and that Black Panther had been invited to join but quit. He officially declared himself neutral during these events. This was when T'Challa married Storm, and although he officially remained neutral, he did secretly give supplies to Cap's side. Meanwhile, in a report to the government in his role as acting chair of the Presidential Superhuman Task Force, Tony said, "Wakanda has not responded well to our subtle threats of force, such as deploying the U.S. Marines to the Wakandan-Ugandan border to practice war games and sending a U.S. warship to the Indian Ocean in striking distance of Wakanda." So Stark was totally aware of, possibly even planning, military actions against Wakanda at this time. And that's not even getting into Project Thunderbolts, in which Tony recruited dozens of villains to send against his former friends. Now, all of this makes Tony look at the bare minimum suspicious and at the most extremely guilty. But next time I want to tell you about why Tony kind of had a point, at least in part. And again, if you want to hear more about my opinions about the Civil War comic, check out My Primos podcast, available this weekend at podcast sources everywhere. All right, I've told you about how the Civil War started and how Tony was really the villain of that entire storyline, but now I need to tell you about how Tony was kind of right. In the final battle, all the combatants were there. Steve's side, Tony's side. We had Clor, who was the clone of Thor, who'd been spending a year dead for tax reasons. We had Captain Marvel, who'd been dead for decades at this point. It was actually a Skrull. And we had Phone Ranger, who had all the powers of a phone. No, really, those are his powers. Or Lectron, who has literally never had a speaking line in a comic, and yet has a whole life story you can read. Or Marvel mainstays like Thunderclap and the Battling Bantam. Never mind if you never heard of them before. But in the midst of all this, we had the fight between two best friends. Two people who had known each other for over a decade. And it sure looked like Steve was about to kill Tony. He only stopped when the people of New York came to stop him. And with that, Tony won the Civil War. But why? Why did all the people of New York go to the guy who was clearly the good guy in this situation if, Tony, as I said last time, was such a villain? In the real world, it is horrible to consider locking people up just for who they are. But when you take that and try to put the metaphor of superpowers on it, it kind of breaks apart. Imagine you have this guy who tells stories so good that they come to life and tower over Manhattan. Or this guy who, when he realized he had powers, accidentally obliterated a small town and then killed several superheroes before they made sure he was never born. In a world in which superheroes and villains and even ordinary people could have the power to completely destroy the world on a whim, it's very scary being a normal human being. Now, the Superhero Registration Act is very flawed, and we'll get into more about that in a second. But in theory, it made sense. You took people who had powers or who wanted to wear a costume and made sure they had training. Many were put into the initiative, where they would serve as emergency services all around the country. But you didn't have to fight. Some, like the new Goliath or Monstro here, went into construction, rebuilding the damage done by super battles. And because the combatants were registered with the government, any kind of damages that were done could now be sued for or covered by insurance, instead of just hoping a supervillain would be willing to pay the damages. But what about benefits to the heroes themselves? Just before Civil War started, Daredevil's identity had been leaked to the public. He was being sued, he was being attacked. If he had been registered, then his identity would have been as protected as those of secret agents. Anyone who leaked it could have been charged with a federal crime. Spider-Man didn't have to publicly reveal his identity. He did that as a favor to Tony, and because, at the time, he believed it was right. And what about those villains that Tony brought on, and those that stayed even after he left office? Well, sure, a lot of them were remorseless killers, but not all of them. Constrictor here had wanted for years to be a good person, but he just never felt like life allowed him to do that. But with the initiative, it forgave his past crimes, and he actually lost his arms defending a school full of superpowered children. He was recognized for this and loved by the public for his sacrifice. Now both reformed villains and heroes could go into emergency situations and help people recognized by authority figures and allowed to do what they needed to do. But that's not really how it went down. See, remember those Cape Killers? They went after everybody, including this young lady, a teenager who called herself Cloud9. Her only ability was to communicate with a living cloud that she could ride on. That's it. She just wanted to fly around and enjoy the skies. She was forced to join the government and not really given the option of doing non-combat work, and trained to be a sniper. By the time the initiative was done with her, she was one of the best sharpshooters in the world, and she'd be doing it from the clouds. Yeah, I wrote about her for Marvel Handbooks, by the way. And of course, a lot of people's big fear was, if somebody in the government has my identity, then anybody can potentially access it. And Tony said, don't worry, I'm going to personally be in charge of this. And nothing's going to go wrong as long as I'm in office. And then something went wrong that took him out of office. After the secret invasion showed the cracks in Tony's armor, the government kicked him out and installed Norman Osborn of all people. And yeah, that went about as well as you'd expect. And remember Prison 42? Well, the registered heroes didn't. Because as soon as things became politically untenable, the U.S. just kind of cut ties with Prison 42 and left it stranded in the negative zone. That included both hardened criminals and heroes like Jack Flagg, who at the time was paraplegic. The inmates had to fend for themselves, eventually escaping on their own. And when they make it back to Earth, can you imagine the lawsuits? Eventually, Norman Osborn's dark reign over the superheroes ended, and they just kind of let the Superhuman Registration Act go away. Tony got to celebrate, and no one bothered to go check on the prisoners or deal with the emotional damage that had been done to so many of those in the initiative, or address the many damages that he did that caused the Civil War. By the way, did anybody ever find out what Tony did? Yes, kind of. Ben Urich and his team of reporters did discover that Tony was secretly enabling supervillains to escape, but that already became public knowledge by the time Project Thunderbolts came out. They never really revealed his interaction with Titanium Man or any possible connection he might have had to Nitro, which I cannot stress enough has never technically been proved. But still, I have described myself as Team Tony. Not because I agree with the things he did, because damn, or because I liked the way things turned out, because that was horrible, but because I saw potential in parts of what they were doing, and more importantly, I put myself in the shoes of a normal person just living on Marvel's Earth, being surrounded by gods, superheroes, and villains, and just hoping they at least learn how to use their powers properly. So that's the background on Marvel's Civil War event, how Tony Stark was probably the ultimate villain of the whole thing, and how the Superhero Registration Act might not have been all bad, but definitely was poorly executed. Anyway, if you want to hear an issue-by-issue breakdown, check out my Primus podcast coming out this weekend. We covered all that. Also, anything else you want me to look into? What happened to Bill Foster in Marvel's Civil War was a tragedy, but there's a secret. Bill's still alive. If you're not familiar, Dr. Bill Foster was a colleague of Hank Pym back when Hank Pym was going from being Ant-Man to being Giant Man. And in fact, he helped Hank Pym stabilize his size-changing abilities and eventually became a hero of his own as it was the 70s, and that's how they named characters in the 70s for some reason. He had sporadic appearances here and there after his series ended, often teaming up with Hank Pym or having solo adventures on his own. And then he kind of appeared out of nowhere to rejoin the Avengers when Civil War went down. And then Cyborg Thor came out and this happened. I've said before that it's extremely unfortunate that Bill was the first and pretty much only main hero to die after the initial event of Civil War. And yeah, that's bad. In the aftermath of the war, his nephew, Tom Foster, became the new Goliath. While the new Goliath struggled with his place in the superhero community, he eventually found himself comfortable among other giant heroes as they fought against the Frost Giants in an invasion of Earth. But Tom doesn't have to be Goliath alone, because Bill's still out there. See, Hank and Bill, they were experts in a lot more stuff than just size changing. I mean, Hank built Ultron, for crying out loud, and together they built heaven, sort of. They built a digital heaven to save the minds of heroes after they died, and an experimental version of this was implanted in Bill's brain. And thanks to this, after his body died, Bill went to a digital heaven. He remains there, as far as we know, because Hank said that he was going to find a better place for him later, and then Hank went kind of nuts and became part of Ultron and other stuff. But the point is this: somewhere out there is a computer that has Bill Foster in it, so he could come back, and I'm ready for it.